Hello, everyone. Story 1. The Vanishing Man of the North Slope. Working in the vast oil production areas of Alaska's North Slope is an experience not suited for everyone. The profound sense of isolation can gradually take its toll, as one is surrounded by nothing but expansive white tundra and persistent frozen darkness for many months on end. The narrator recounted that they had been engaged in pipeline maintenance duties near Prudhoe Bay for approximately 6 years, when the unsettling incident occurred in February 2018. The financial compensation was exceptionally good, which served as the primary motivation for individuals like the narrator, Brad and Tommy, to return for successive operational seasons. They comprised a closely knit team, consistently supporting one another through intense blizzards and critical equipment malfunctions that posed a lethal threat, potentially causing death faster than one could radio for assistance. During that particular work rotation, their crew had just completed a week-long repair assignment on a section of pipe that had developed stress fractures due to the relentless freeze-thaw cycles. The Northern Energy Corp, the entity employing them, had accommodated them in one of its prefabricated shelters situated about 40 miles south of Deadhorse, directly adjacent to the Dalton Highway, famously known as the ice road utilized by truckers. The return journey to their main base should have been routine, as they had traversed it countless times previously in Brad's specially modified Ford F-350, a vehicle equipped with chains on all 4 tires and ample heating to prevent anyone from succumbing to the extreme cold. Tommy was sprawled across the back seat, trying to catch up on sleep, while the narrator occupied the shotgun seat, providing companionship to Brad as he navigated through what was developing into a significant snowstorm. Visibility was severely limited, perhaps reaching only 30 feet on an exceptionally clear stretch. The vehicle's headlights merely reflected off the swirling snow, creating a mesmerizing white tunnel effect that induced a sensation of flying through empty space. Approximately 2 hours into their drive, Brad abruptly engaged the brakes with such force that it caused Tommy to lurch forward, hitting the back of the narrator's seat and narrowly avoiding impact with the windshield. Barely discernible through the storm was a figure stumbling along the side of the road. There was no vehicle visible nearby. No emergency lights flashing, just this solitary individual, seemingly clad in a heavy parka, moving with the desperate, uncoordinated gait characteristic of someone succumbing to hypothermia. Brad immediately pulled over, as it is an unwritten rule that one does not abandon anyone in such severe weather conditions, especially when temperatures plummet to 40 degrees below zero and continue to worsen. Tommy jolted awake, initially cursing about the sudden stop, but quickly fell silent upon observing what they were all looking at. The trio remained seated for about 5 seconds, watching the man struggle through knee-deep snow approximately 20 yards ahead. His parka appeared to be an old military surplus item, olive green in color with fur trim around the hood that continuously whipped around in the strong wind. What instantly struck the narrator as peculiar was the man's manner of walking. It wasn't the typical stumbling, faltering gait of someone battling extreme cold, but rather a mechanical, repetitive motion, as if he were meticulously following a track visible only to him. Brad honked the vehicle's horn twice, yet the man did not even turn his head, simply continuing to move forward 1 foot after the other with his arms hanging loosely at his sides. "Jesus Christ, he's going to die out there," Tommy exclaimed, already reaching for his door handle. Brad then shifted the truck into park, and all 3 of them exited the vehicle, the wind immediately assailing them like 1,000 tiny knives. Even with their substantial protective gear, the intense cold attempted to infiltrate every vulnerable gap and zipper. They began jogging toward the man, calling out to him, their voices swiftly swallowed by the roaring storm. When they got within 10 feet, Brad grasped the man's shoulder to turn him around, and that was the moment things took an exceedingly strange turn. The man's face was remarkably pale, specifically paper white, yet it bore no signs of frostbite. His eyes were a cloudy gray color resembling dirty ice, and they seemed to gaze directly through them. He had approximately 3 days of stubble, a dark contrast against his unnaturally white skin. Furthermore, his lips were in constant motion, forming words that were inaudible over the wind. However, it was the distinctive scar that caused Brad to recoil a step, a jagged line extending from his left temple down to his jaw, the type of mark that suggested someone had endured and survived an ordeal they likely should not have. Sir, are you okay?" Tommy shouted, waving his hand in front of the man's face, but there was no response. The individual simply stood there, swaying slightly, his cloudy eyes fixated on something beyond them, beyond the storm, beyond everything perceivable. His lips never ceased their movement, and when the narrator leaned in closer, fighting every primal instinct to retreat, he could just discern what the man was continuously repeating. 247, 247, 247, over and over like a broken record. Brad and Tommy exchanged uneasy glances. They had all heard anecdotes about individuals losing their sanity due to the isolation in this region. But this situation was distinctly different, feeling profoundly wrong on an inexplicable level. Nevertheless, they understood they had to get him into the truck. Setting aside ethical considerations, leaving him behind would entail the grim task of explaining a frozen corpse to the state troopers, a bureaucratic burden none of them desired. It required the combined effort of all three of them to guide him to the ford. He offered no resistance, yet he provided no assistance either, allowing them to move him like a mere mannequin. His body felt stiff and cold, even through the thick parka. The most peculiar aspect was his complete absence of shivering. In the Arctic, one learns that shivering is the body's ultimate defense mechanism against the cold. Once it ceases, one is in dire trouble. But this man, despite his ice-cold skin, displayed no shivering whatsoever. They managed to get him into the back seat with Tommy, who pressed himself against the far door as if attempting to phase through it. Brad then turned the heat to its maximum setting and resumed their journey onto the Dalton Highway. For about 10 minutes, a profound silence enveloped them, broken only by the full blast of the heater fan and the man's lips still moving, still forming those identical numbers. Then Tommy cleared his throat and articulated the unspoken thought shared by all of them. "Guys, doesn't he look like that missing snowmobiler from a couple of years back? The one where they found the sled but never the body?" Brad's knuckles whitened as he gripped the steering wheel. The narrator recalled that story, as did everyone who worked the slope. It was February 2016 when a local man named Christopher Vaughn went missing during a solo snowmobile excursion. His sled had been discovered wrapped around a tree approximately 15 miles from where they had just picked up their silent passenger. There was blood on the seat, and distinct drag marks leading into the woods that simply abruptly ceased. Search teams scoured the area for 2 weeks before finally abandoning their efforts, as in such extreme cold without shelter, survival time is typically only a few hours. He had been officially declared dead, and a memorial service had even been held. Christopher's brother, who worked for one of the drilling companies and frequented the same bar in Deadhorse, had mentioned that Christopher bore that exact scar from a childhood accident involving a boat propeller. The more the narrator observed their silent passenger in the rearview mirror, the more his gut churned with unease. The same scar, the same facial contours, even the same eye color. Although Christopher's eyes had appeared brown in photographs, not this milky gray. The shelter suddenly materialized through the storm like a metallic oasis, its yellow lights barely piercing the impenetrable white wall of snow. They attempted to radio ahead but received nothing but static, which was not uncommon in such severe weather. The structure was one of the modular units that Arctic Flow Solutions had strategically placed along the pipeline route, essentially a reinforced shipping container outfitted with bunks, a kitchenette, and a communication system. Brad parked as close to the door as possible, and they prepared to move their passenger inside. It was then that the man spoke for the very first time, his voice gravelly and distorted like someone attempting to speak underwater. "Can't go in? Not yet. Not until 2:47. Tommy literally jumped, banging his head on the doorframe. However, regardless of the man's protest, they were not going to leave anyone in the truck to freeze. It required Brad's bear hug from behind while Tommy and the narrator each took an arm, but they eventually managed to get him through the door. The instant they crossed the threshold, he became completely limp, a dead weight that almost caused all of them to fall to the floor. They laid him on one of the bottom bunks, and Brad proceeded to check the radio while Tommy put water on for coffee. The narrator remained with their guest, checking his pulse, which was slow but steady, and attempting to comprehend the nature of what they had discovered. Up close, under the stark fluorescent lights, additional unsettling details became apparent. His fingernails were excessively long, curved and yellowish, as if he had not trimmed them in months. Strangely, there was no discernible odor, which bothered the narrator more than it should have. Someone who had been wandering the wilderness should have emitted the smell of sweat, body odor, something. But there was nothing, just a neutral, almost sterile absence of scent. His parka pockets were empty except for a single item that caused the narrator's chest to tighten. A snowmobile key on a leather fob, the kind sold at the Dead Horse gas station. The leather was cracked and weathered, and branded into it was C. Vaughn 2015. Tommy returned with the coffee and saw the narrator holding the key. His face turned pale, and he set the mugs down so forcefully that coffee sloshed everywhere. "That's not possible," Tommy whispered, but both of them knew it was undeniably present in the narrator's hand. Brad returned from the radio room, shaking his head. The storm was interfering with all communication. They were stuck until it passed, likely another 8 to 10 hours. It was at that moment that the power flickered just once, but enough to make all of them look up at the ceiling. These shelters were equipped with backup generators that activated automatically, so power issues were a rare occurrence. The lights steadied, but a palpable shift had occurred in the room. Their passengers' eyes were wide open, staring directly at the clock on the wall, which read 11:30 p.m. His lips began moving again, faster this time, repeating that same mantra. 2:47. Tommy gripped the narrator's arm hard enough to leave a bruise. "We need to get out of here," he declared. "Right now, storm or no storm." But Brad was already shaking his head, pointing at the window where the snow was falling so thickly that they couldn't even see the truck parked 10 feet away. They were trapped, and deep within the narrator's primal brain, he had the unsettling feeling that this was precisely what was meant to happen. The subsequent few hours crawled by with agonizing slowness like molasses. They took turns observing their mysterious visitor while attempting to maintain some semblance of normalcy. Brad prepared sandwiches that no one ate. Tommy cleaned his tools for the third time, and the narrator continuously checked the weather outside, hoping for any indication of a break. The man never moved from the bunk, simply lying there with his eyes fixated on that clock, his lips moving in their endless countdown. Around 2 a.m., extreme exhaustion overwhelmed them. Tommy volunteered for the first watch while Brad and the narrator settled into bunks on the opposite side of the room. The narrator initially thought he wouldn't be able to sleep, but the sudden crash of adrenaline knocked him out cold. He awoke to Tommy violently shaking him, his eyes wide with palpable panic. The clock displayed 2:46 a.m. Brad was already awake, standing by the door with a wrench firmly in his hand. "He's gone," Tommy gasped. The narrator had only looked away for a second to check the coffee pot, and when he turned back, the bunk was conspicuously empty. They meticulously searched the shelter, every 40 feet of it, but there was absolutely nowhere for the man to hide. He had simply vanished. It was then that they heard it, 3 deliberate knocks on the metal door. They were slow, measured, the kind of knocks that conveyed an impression that someone knew precisely what they were doing. The time was 2:47 a.m. The knocking resumed, this time emanating from the window on the north wall, then the south window, and then returning to the door. It seemed to circle the shelter, as if something was pacing around outside, systematically testing each entrance. Brad gripped the wrench even tighter. "That's impossible," he stated. "Nobody could survive out there without gear." But all 3 of them knew that their visitor had not exactly been normal. The knocking ceased at 2:48 a.m., leaving them in a silence so profound it felt like a physical pressure in their ears. They remained frozen in place until dawn, no one willing to be the first to move. When the storm finally broke around 7 a.m., they made a discovery that sent them scrambling for the truck. There were absolutely no footprints anywhere around the shelter, not leading away from the door, not under the windows. Nothing. The snow was pristine, utterly untouched, but Tommy never made it to the truck. When Brad and the narrator turned around, Tommy was simply gone. There was no sound, no struggle, no tracks. Just empty air where he had been standing 2 seconds prior. They sped away from the site and did not stop until they reached Fairbanks, where they filed a missing person report, recounted picking up the stranger but omitted the part about him possibly being Christopher Vaughn. The troopers located Tommy's body 3 days later, 15 miles from the shelter, in the exact spot where Vaughn's snowmobile had crashed. He was frozen solid, his lips blue with drag marks in the snow that, just like Vaughn's, simply stopped. Story 2. The Perpetual Visitor of Pump 4. The nights at the mile 237. Fuel stops stretched interminably, each one blending into the next until the very concept of time lost all meaning for the narrator. The narrator had been employed there since early November, tending the counter while fierce Arctic winds rattled the windows and massive 18-wheelers rolled past like apparitions on the Dalton Highway. The job offered sufficient compensation for a college student aiming to save money, and the owner, an elderly man named Eugene, was not overly inquisitive when the narrator requested additional shifts. Most nights passed without notable incident. Truckers stopping for coffee, locals replenishing their tanks, perhaps an occasional tourist who had become disoriented in a storm. The station itself was rather unremarkable. 2 fuel pumps situated out front, a modest convenience store stocked with overpriced snacks, and a restroom that barely functioned when the pipes weren't completely frozen. Everything changed on the narrator's 3rd Wednesday working there. The clock had just struck 2 a.m. when the narrator observed headlights piercing through the intense blizzard outside. An old blue Chevy pickup, its paint job heavily rusted, slowly pulled up to pump number 4 and simply halted. The driver did not exit the vehicle, did not reach for his wallet, nor did he even bother to turn off the engine. He merely sat there, visible only as a dark silhouette through the frost-covered windshield. After approximately 10 minutes, the narrator speculated that perhaps he was experiencing car trouble or had fallen asleep. However, just as the narrator grabbed his jacket to investigate, the truck abruptly reversed and disappeared back into the storm. It was certainly strange, yet in a place like that, strangeness was a relative concept. The narrator made a note in the logbook and returned to restocking energy drinks, assuming that would be the end of the matter. The following Wednesday arrived with yet another blizzard, even more severe than the previous one. Visibility plummeted to perhaps 20 feet, and the relentless wind caused the entire building to creak like an ancient ship. Eugene had forewarned the narrator about such nights, explaining that sometimes the weather became so prohibitive that even the most seasoned truckers would choose to hunker down rather than risk the treacherous highway. The narrator was engrossed in counting inventory in the back room, attempting to remain occupied, when he heard the familiar rumble of an engine outside. The clock on the wall indicated precisely 2 a.m. Through the security monitor, the narrator watched that identical blue Chevy pull up to Pump 4, occupying the same spot as before, and the driver performed the exact same action. Absolutely nothing. This time, the narrator managed to obtain a better camera angle, allowing him to discern more details. The man wore what appeared to be a heavy winter coat with the hood pulled up, and his hands gripped the steering wheel at precisely the 10 and 2 o'clock positions. He never adjusted his posture, never reached for the radio, and never even seemed to breathe. The narrator allowed the situation to continue for 15 minutes this time before deciding to approach him. The very moment the narrator stepped toward the door, keys in hand, the truck's reverse lights illuminated. By the time the narrator pushed through the wind and snow to reach Pump 4, nothing remained but tire tracks, already being swiftly erased by the ongoing storm. The entire episode left the narrator feeling profoundly unsettled in a manner he could not quite articulate. There was something distinctly mechanical about the driver's movements, or rather his lack thereof, akin to watching a video loop. The narrator spent the remainder of his shift jumping at every set of headlights that passed, but the blue Chevy did not reappear. When Eugene arrived for the morning shift, the narrator casually mentioned the incidents, trying to maintain an indifferent tone. Eugene merely shrugged and remarked, "We got all kinds out here, especially during storm season." However, the narrator noticed that Eugene avoided making eye contact when he said this, and his fingers nervously drummed on the counter. By the third Wednesday, the narrator had mentally prepared himself. He had even deliberately swapped shifts with Jasmine specifically to be present at 2 a.m., though he withheld the true reason from her. The security system at the station was ancient but still functional, a setup from the early 2000s that recorded everything on a continuous loop, overwriting footage after 7 days. The narrator had figured out how to save clips to a USB drive and had one readily available in his pocket. The storm that night was less severe, just a steady snowfall instead of a full blizzard, which meant improved visibility. The narrator positioned himself behind the counter with a clear view of Pump 4, feigning interest in a magazine while he waited. At 1:58 a.m., he heard it. That distinctive engine rumble growing louder as the vehicle approached from the north. The blue Chevy materialized from the darkness as if summoned, pulling into the exact same spot with practiced precision. This time, the narrator was ready with the camera controls, zooming in as close as the antiquated system would permit. What he saw made his skin crawl. The man in the driver's seat wasn't merely still. He was impossibly still. There were no minuscule movements from breathing, no shifting to get comfortable, no fidgeting or checking mirrors. His face remained obscured beneath that heavy hood, but his hands on the steering wheel appeared strangely wrong. The skin possessed a grayish tint, even accounting for the poor camera quality, and the fingers seemed excessively rigid as if they had been frozen in place. The narrator recorded everything, his pulse hammering as he watched the figure sit there for precisely 10 minutes. Then, right on schedule, the reverse lights illuminated. But this time, instead of backing straight out, the truck turned slightly, and for just a second, the driver's side faced directly toward the camera. The hood fell back just enough for the narrator to glimpse his face, and what he saw sent him stumbling backward into the cigarette display. The features were undeniably human, yet fundamentally wrong. There were sunken eyes that reflected no light, skin that resembled old leather, and an expression of complete, utter emptiness. There was no sign of recognition, no emotion, nothing that suggested a living person occupied that driver's seat. The truck vanished into the night before the narrator could regain his composure. He spent the subsequent hour replaying the footage, attempting to convince himself that he had misinterpreted what he had seen, that the dim lighting and outdated camera had played tricks on his perception. However, each viewing only served to confirm his initial impression. Whoever or whatever occupied that truck was not right. The narrator saved multiple copies of the recording and began diligently sifting through the station's old logbooks, extending his search back months, then years. Eugene maintained meticulous records in a storage closet located behind the break room. Dusty binders filled with delivery schedules, maintenance reports, and incident logs dating back to the station's inauguration in 1987. It was then that the narrator discovered the first mention of such an occurrence, from December 1993. It was a note regarding a customer complaint about an abandoned vehicle at Pump 4 during the 2 a.m. hour. The description perfectly matched: blue Chevy pickup, lone male driver, never exits the vehicle. The entries appeared sporadically thereafter, always on Wednesdays, always during winter storms, and always at precisely 2 a.m. The true shock came when the narrator unearthed a folder labeled Incident Reports, Law Enforcement, tucked behind the older logs. Inside were photocopied police reports, missing person flyers, and newspaper clippings. One article immediately captivated his attention. An article from January 1992 concerning a local man named Walter Hicks, who had disappeared during a severe blizzard. He had been driving home from his employment at a mining camp when his truck, a blue 1988 Chevy Silverado, vanished somewhere along the Dalton Highway. Search parties found no trace of him or the vehicle despite extensive efforts. The article included a photograph of Walter, and even in the grainy newspaper reproduction, the narrator recognized those sunken features. But it was the final document in the folder that compelled the narrator to drop everything and reach for his phone. Someone had conducted a license plate check 2 years prior and attached the results. The plate belonged to Walter Hicks, and according to DMV records, it had been registered to a vehicle declared missing in January 1992, over 30 years ago. The narrator attempted to call Eugene, but his phone went straight to voicemail. The next Wednesday loomed just 2 days away, and the narrator was torn between quitting immediately or remaining to confront whatever entity continuously returned to Pump 4. Curiosity ultimately prevailed, coupled with a strange sense of obligation, as if the narrator needed to comprehend this for Walter's sake, wherever he truly was. The narrator spent those 2 days researching everything he could find regarding the disappearance. Walter had been 28 years old when he vanished, worked rotating shifts at the Aurora Ore Works, and left behind a wife and infant daughter. The search efforts had been severely impeded by the blizzard that night, with visibility nearly zero and temperatures plummeting to 40 degrees below zero. One particular detail from the police report stood out. Walter's last radio contact with the mining camp mentioned stopping for gas, though he never specified the location. The timeline would have placed him near mile 237 around 2 a.m., precisely when the storm reached its zenith. The narrator also uncovered something else in the newspaper archives. 3 other individuals had gone missing along that specific stretch of highway over the years. All during winter storms, all late at night. None of them were ever found. Wednesday arrived with surprisingly clear skies for once, stars brilliantly visible through the station windows, and the temperature hovering around -20 degrees. The narrator had convinced himself that perhaps the clear weather would break the pattern, that whatever brought Walter's truck back only appeared during storms. But at 1:45 a.m., clouds rolled in from nowhere, bringing snow that fell in thick, heavy sheets. By 1:55 a.m., visibility had plummeted to almost nothing, and the narrator knew he would come. The narrator had prepared everything: fresh batteries in his flashlight, his phone fully charged, Eugene's number on speed dial, and a baseball bat from the storage room tucked securely behind the counter. At exactly 2 a.m., those familiar headlights pierced through the swirling snow. The blue Chevy rolled up to Pump 4 with that same mechanical precision, and Walter, or the thing that used to be Walter, sat behind the wheel in his eternal vigil. This time the narrator did not hesitate. He grabbed the flashlight and bat, took a deep breath, and pushed out into the raging storm. The cold struck him like a physical blow, instantly stealing his breath and causing his eyes to water. Snow swirled in chaotic patterns, reducing the world to a blinding white void broken only by the dim glow of the station lights and the truck's idling engine. As the narrator approached Pump 4, battling against the relentless wind with every step, he noticed something that had not been discernible on the cameras. The snow around the truck fell differently, creating a perfect circle where not a single flake touched the vehicle. Even stranger, the windows showed no fog from breathing, no condensation from body heat. The interior appeared as cold as the frigid air outside. The narrator reached the driver's side door, his flashlight beam illuminating that terrible face in profile. Up close, Walter's features were even more unsettling. Skin like ancient parchment stretched tautly over bone, eyes that were open but perceived nothing, lips slightly parted as if frozen mid-word. The narrator raised his hand to knock on the window, and that was the moment everything went completely askew. The instant his knuckles made contact with the glass, the station's power failed entirely. The pumps went dark. The building behind him vanished into absolute blackness, and even his flashlight flickered and died. In that sudden, profound darkness, the narrator heard the truck's door creak open for the first time. The emergency generator should have activated within seconds, but the darkness persisted. The narrator stumbled backward, wildly swinging the bat blindly while desperately attempting to restart his flashlight with numb fingers. Then, impossibly, he saw light emanating from inside the station. It wasn't the harsh fluorescent glow, but a soft, pale luminescence. Through the snow, the narrator could discern a figure standing inside, perfectly still, facing outward. The proportions were wrong, too tall and too thin, but the narrator recognized the heavy winter coat and the hollow face. Walter stood inside the locked station on the wrong side of the front window, staring directly out at the narrator. Frost spread across the glass from where he stood, forming intricate patterns that crept outward like frozen veins. The truly horrifying part was that the narrator could still hear the truck idling behind him, its engine running smoothly and steadily. He turned his head just enough to confirm what he already knew. The driver's seat was empty, the door hanging open like a gaping mouth. When he looked back at the station, Walter had moved even closer to the glass, close enough that the narrator could distinguish every detail of his ruined face. Those empty eyes were fixed on his with an intensity that caused his chest to tighten with panic. The sound that followed would haunt the narrator forever. A voice like wind whistling through a frozen pipe, muffled by the glass, yet clear enough to understand. Still. Looking for Pump 4. Each word emerged slowly and laboriously, accompanied by more frost spreading across the window until the entire storefront was obscured by a white sheet of ice. The narrator backed away, slipping on the snow-covered ground, the bat now useless in his trembling grip. Behind him, the truck's engine suddenly revved, its headlights flashing in a rhythm that seemed almost like Morse code. The pale glow inside the station began to pulse in sync with the lights, and the narrator realized with growing horror that Walter was not alone in there. Shadows moved behind him, other figures in winter gear, all now standing at the windows, 4 of them total, including Walter, matching the exact number of missing persons the narrator had read about. They all stared out with those same empty eyes, their mouths moving in unison to form words that the narrator could not discern over the storm. The frost on the windows began to coalesce into letters, spelled out in ice. "Help us find the way." The narrator ran not back to the truck, not to the highway, but around the building to the employee entrance, fumbling with his keys while those dead eyes tracked his movement through every single window. The door finally gave way, and the narrator burst inside, slamming it shut behind him and throwing the deadbolt. The emergency lights abruptly blazed to life, revealing an empty store. There were no figures at the windows, no frost on the glass. Everything appeared normal except for the tumultuous thundering of his own heartbeat. But the truck was still out there. The narrator could hear it idling at pump 4. He called 911 with trembling fingers, babbling about intruders and power outages. Anything to get someone else there. While waiting, he grabbed the USB drive containing the footage and stuffed it into his pocket. Then he noticed something that made him sick. The clock on the wall showed 2:47 a.m., but according to his phone, only 10 minutes had passed since the power had inexplicably gone out. The responding officer found nothing. No truck, no footprints except the narrator's own, no frost damage to the windows. The next morning, the narrator handed Eugene his resignation, packed his belongings, and left Alaska entirely. But sometimes, on cold winter nights when the snow falls heavily, the narrator still dreams about Pump 4 and those words traced in ice. He never discovered what they were looking for, and honestly, he hopes he never does. Story 3. The Orchestrated Hunt in Copper River Basin. October 2019 marked a significant turning point in the relationship between the narrator and his father. They had meticulously planned this moose hunting expedition in Alaska's Copper River Basin for several months. It was intended to be their first genuine father-son trip since the narrator, now 28 and working in consulting, had relocated to Seattle 3 years prior. And honestly, he hadn't spent more than a weekend with his father since college. His father had been hunting in that particular region for over 2 decades, intimately familiar with every ridge and creek as if they were extensions of his own backyard. They drove up from Anchorage in his father's reliable Chevy Silverado, rifles securely fastened and camping gear tightly packed. Both were genuinely enthusiastic about disconnecting from the world for 5 uninterrupted days. The plan seemed straightforward. Track some moose, perhaps achieve a clean shot with a stroke of luck, and simply immerse themselves in the wilderness, free from cell towers or the constant buzzing of work emails in their pockets. The first day unfolded precisely as they had envisioned. They hiked approximately 6 miles from their parking spot, establishing a solid campsite near a narrow creek that bisected a valley surrounded by dense spruce and birch trees. His father exuded that characteristic confident swagger he always displayed in the woods, expertly pointing out animal signs, explaining intricate wind patterns, and sharing captivating stories about previous hunts in the area. The weather was crisp, but not brutally cold. Perhaps 35 degrees Fahrenheit with clear skies and that perfect autumn light filtering through the trees. They meticulously set up their tent, organized their gear, and spent the evening strategizing their route for the following morning while sharing a thermos of coffee, discreetly spiked with whiskey. Everything felt normal, even peaceful. Both were fatigued from the hike, conversing quietly about family matters, work-related stress, and life in general. Neither of them had any inkling that they were already under constant observation. The strangeness commenced on day 2. They had been hiking for about 3 hours, following a game trail that wound its way up through a series of rocky outcrops. Suddenly, his father came to an abrupt halt, staring intently at something about 30 yards ahead, his expression transitioning from casual interest to genuine confusion. When the narrator caught up to him, he saw what had captured his father's attention. Scattered pieces of what had once been a caribou, but unlike any kill the narrator had ever witnessed before. The bones were picked completely clean, almost with surgical precision. However, the most peculiar aspect was the arrangement of the pieces. They were not merely randomly scattered, as would be the case with a typical predator kill. Instead, they formed a peculiar pattern, almost as if they had been deliberately placed in a rough circle around a flat boulder. The skull sat precisely in the center, its empty sockets gazing up at the gray sky, and the larger bones radiated outward like spokes on a wheel. His father knelt beside the remains, carefully running his fingers along the cleanly stripped bone edges. He had been hunting for over 20 years, seen numerous bear kills, wolf packs feeding, and even mountain lion attacks, but this was undeniably different. The bones were excessively clean, too meticulously organized, and there wasn't a single track anywhere in the soft earth surrounding the site, not even a partial paw print or scuff mark. "Kevin," his father said quietly, using the narrator's full name, a sign that he was seriously concerned. "I've never seen anything like this. Whatever did this, it's big enough to take down a full-grown caribou, but smart enough to not leave any evidence behind." They spent another 10 minutes examining the area, circling wider and wider, but found absolutely nothing. No fur, no blood trail, no disturbance in the surrounding vegetation. It was as if the animal had simply materialized, meticulously arranged these bones with surgical precision, and then vanished into thin air. They attempted to dismiss the incident and continued their hunt, but the discovery had clearly unnerved both of them. His father kept glancing back toward the bone site, and the narrator found himself scanning the tree line more frequently than usual. Approximately 2 miles further along the trail, they discovered another kill. This time, it was a ptarmigan, but again the remains were arranged in that same unnatural pattern. The small bones formed a perfect miniature circle around a smooth river stone, with the tiny skull positioned precisely in the center. What made it even more disturbing was that ptarmigans are ground birds, easy prey for foxes or hawks, but there were no feathers scattered around, no signs of a struggle, nothing to indicate a normal predator-prey encounter. His father picked up one of the delicate wing bones and held it up to the light, demonstrating to the narrator how cleanly it had been stripped of meat. "This is surgical work," he muttered, his voice barely above a whisper. "No animal does this kind of precision cleaning naturally." The pattern persisted throughout the day. They found 5 more kill sites, each one more unsettling than the last. A ground squirrel meticulously arranged around a piece of quartz, a marten's bones forming a perfect circle around a flat piece of shale. Each site was immaculate, almost sterile, with that same eerie precision that caused the hair on the narrator's arms to stand on end. What truly disturbed the narrator was the escalation. The kills were becoming progressively fresher as they ventured deeper into the basin. The first caribou had likely been there for days, perhaps weeks, but the most recent sites still retained the metallic scent of fresh death. His father began walking differently, keeping his rifle ready, constantly checking behind them. Neither of them wished to admit it aloud, but they both knew that something was tracking their movements, staying just far enough ahead to prepare these grotesque displays for them to find. It felt as though they were being lured deeper into its territory, following a trail of increasingly fresh kills that served as both a warning and an invitation. That night, they established camp in a small clearing encircled by thick spruce trees. Both were too on edge to venture any further. His father insisted they keep the fire burning all night, taking turns on watch despite never having done so on previous camping trips. The narrator took the first shift, sitting with his back against a fallen log, rifle across his lap, listening intently to every snap of branches and rustle of leaves in the profound darkness beyond their firelight. Around 2 a.m., during his father's watch, the narrator awoke to the urgent whisper of his name. When he opened his eyes, his father was pointing toward the opposite side of the clearing, his face pale in the flickering orange glow. "There," he breathed, indicating between 2 large spruces. "Don't move too fast, but tell me what you see." The narrator slowly turned his head, following his father's gaze, and that was when he saw them. 2 enormous yellow eyes reflecting their firelight, positioned approximately 8 feet off the ground, completely motionless. They were not the typical green eye shine one would expect from a deer or moose, but an intense, almost golden color that seemed to pulse with intelligence. The eyes watched them for what felt like hours, but was probably only 15 minutes. They never blinked, never moved, just maintained that steady, calculating stare that caused the narrator's skin to crawl. His father had his rifle aimed at the spot, but neither of them could discern any body shape or outline in the darkness behind those eyes. Whatever was observing them was massive. The eye placement alone suggested something significantly larger than any wolf or bear the narrator had ever encountered. The strangest part was its absolute silence. There were no breathing sounds, no movement of vegetation, no shifting of weight from one foot to another. Just those unblinking eyes studying them with what felt like predatory patience. When dawn finally began to break and the first gray light filtered through the trees, the eyes simply vanished. One moment they were there, the next they were gone, as if they had never existed at all. They meticulously searched the area once they had sufficient light, but found no tracks, no disturbed vegetation, no physical evidence that anything had been there. Day 3 altered everything. They had been hiking for about 4 hours, both of them jumpy and exhausted from the sleepless night when they reached the ridgeline overlooking the main valley. His father was using his binoculars to scan for moose sign when he suddenly went completely rigid. "Jesus Christ," he whispered, handing the binoculars to the narrator with trembling fingers. "Tell me I'm not losing my mind." The narrator adjusted the focus and looked where his father was pointing. And there it was. Standing on the opposite ridge, perhaps 800 yards away, was the largest wolf the narrator had ever seen. But merely calling it a wolf did not do it justice. This creature was enormous, easily the size of a small horse, with a massive head and shoulders that seemed disproportionately broad for any normal canine. Its fur was almost black except for peculiar silver markings along its spine that caught the sunlight like polished metal. What caused the narrator's heart to race was the way it was standing, completely still, facing directly toward them as if it had been waiting for them to reach that exact spot. The wolf stood there for maybe 2 minutes, just observing them through what must have been its own incredible vision. Even at that considerable distance, the narrator could feel the weight of its attention, as if it were cataloging every detail of their appearance and behavior. His father was fumbling with his rifle, attempting to get a clear shot, but the range was too far for any reliable accuracy. Then, without any warning or gradual movement, the wolf turned and began walking along the ridgeline with a fluid, almost flowing gait that appeared unnatural. It moved like a liquid shadow, covering ground impossibly fast while maintaining perfect balance on terrain that would challenge even an experienced mountain climber. What terrified the narrator most was how it would periodically stop every 100 yards or so, turn back toward them and wait just long enough for them to track its movement before continuing. It was clearly demonstrating that it could outmaneuver them effortlessly, that it had been controlling this entire encounter from the very beginning. That's when everything suddenly became clear to the narrator. The bone arrangements, the progressively fresher kills as they ventured deeper into the basin, the silent nighttime surveillance, and now this calculated display of dominance. They weren't hunting in its territory. They were being hunted by it. This was not some random predator protecting its domain. This was something far more intelligent and deliberate. The wolf had been shadowing them for the entire trip, staying just close enough to monitor their movements while leaving those grotesque calling cards to announce its presence. His father must have reached the same conclusion because he grabbed the narrator's arm and stated, "We're leaving right now. This thing has been playing with us." They packed up their gear with frantic efficiency, abandoning any pretense of continuing the hunt. As they began their descent back toward the valley, the narrator could not resist one last look through the binoculars. The wolf was still there, now sitting like some ancient sentinel, observing their retreat with what the narrator swore looked like satisfaction. The hike back to their truck consumed 6 hours of non-stop walking, both of them continuously checking the ridge lines and tree lines around them. They did not speak much during the descent, but the narrator could discern that his father was processing the same unsettling realization that plagued him. That massive wolf had been orchestrating their entire experience from day one. Every kill site, every peculiar arrangement of bones, every moment of increasing unease had been meticulously planned to guide them deeper into its domain until it was ready to reveal itself. When they finally reached the Silverado, his father threw their gear into the bed with trembling hands and started the engine before the narrator had even closed his door. As they drove away, the narrator watched the wilderness disappear in the side mirror, and he swore he could still feel those golden eyes tracking their movement. They never returned to that area, and his father sold his hunting gear the following spring. Neither of them ever discussed what they had experienced, but the narrator knew they both understood that they had encountered something that should not exist. An apex predator with intelligence that bordered on the supernatural, and they had been incredibly fortunate to leave its territory alive. Story 4. The Silent Disappearance of the Caribou. The Caribou Migration Project seemed like the ideal opportunity to advance the narrator's career as a wildlife biologist. After 6 years of undertaking smaller research assignments, the narrator finally had the chance to lead a team studying how climate change was disrupting traditional migration routes near the Yukon River. The assignment was confirmed in late April 2017, and within 2 weeks the narrator was heading into the Canadian wilderness with a 5-person research team. Their task involved monitoring 43 GPS-collared caribou over 3 weeks, meticulously documenting their movements and behavioral patterns. The data they collected held the potential to influence conservation policies across the entire region, making this one of the most crucial projects the narrator had ever been involved in. The narrator recalled feeling a mixture of excitement and responsibility as they loaded their essential gear. Thermal drones, advanced tracking equipment, and ample camping supplies for an extended stay in seriously remote territory. Their base camp was established at an old logging site that had been abandoned sometime in the 1980s. The location was perfectly suited for their research objectives: flat ground for equipment setup, close proximity to the river for water access, and strategically positioned directly along one of the main caribou migration corridors. However, the place possessed an unsettling atmosphere that the narrator could not quite shake. Rusted machinery lay half-buried beneath decades of moss and fallen leaves, while decaying wooden structures slowly succumbed to the encroaching forest. The narrator's team consisted of Dr. James Mitchell, their seasoned project leader, Lisa Chen from the Yukon Wild Track Institute, and 2 graduate students named Alex and Maria. They had previously collaborated on other assignments, ensuring an established workflow for organizing their campsite, distributing daily responsibilities, and settling into their research routine. The initial few days proceeded precisely according to plan, with clear, consistent GPS signals continuously streaming in from all tagged animals. The work itself was methodical and profoundly rewarding. Every morning, they would diligently check their tracking systems while sipping coffee around the portable camp stove, observing dozens of red dots moving across their digital maps. The caribou were adhering to their expected routes, congregating in feeding areas during the day and steadily migrating northward each night. Lisa managed the thermal drone flights, capturing crucial behavioral footage that would complement their GPS data. Alex and Maria took turns monitoring the radio frequencies, while Dr. Mitchell and the narrator analyzed movement patterns and updated their field notes. The weather remained steady: cool mornings, warm afternoons, and crystal clear nights. Ideal conditions for equipment operation. By day 5, they had documented some fascinating deviations from historical migration patterns. Precisely the kind of data that would elevate the value of their research. The routine was comfortable, predictable, and everything was progressing according to their meticulously planned schedule. During those initial several days, the narrator began to observe subtle details about the abandoned logging site that had not been immediately apparent. There were perfectly straight cut marks on certain trees, far too precise to be natural, suggesting the loggers had utilized some form of advanced equipment for their time. The concrete foundations of demolished buildings formed geometric patterns that seemed almost deliberate, as if whoever had designed the original layout had a specific organizational system in mind. Most intriguingly, they discovered several metal plates buried beneath decades of debris, each one stamped with sequential numbers, but lacking any company identification or dates. Dr. Mitchell remarked that logging operations from that era typically left more obvious traces, such as marked trees, equipment serial numbers, or proper signage. But this place was distinctly different, almost sterile in how thoroughly it had been cleared of identifying information. Still, it did not impede their research, and they had more pressing concerns than investigating the site's mysterious past. Everything changed on the night of May 15th. The narrator was reviewing data logs in his tent around 11:30 p.m. when Alex burst in from the monitoring station, his face pale in the lantern light. "Heather, you need to see this right now," he stated, his voice strained with concern. All 43 GPS signals had disappeared simultaneously at exactly 11:17 p.m., not gradually, not one by one, but all at once, as if someone had abruptly flipped a switch. The tracking system displayed no error messages, no equipment malfunctions, no technical explanations for the sudden blackout. Lisa ran diagnostics on their receivers while Dr. Mitchell checked the backup systems, but everything on their end was functioning perfectly. They spent the next 3 hours attempting to re-establish contact, adjusting frequencies, boosting signal strength, and even trying manual pings to individual callers. Nothing worked. The caribou had simply vanished from their monitoring network, leaving them staring at empty screens and pondering what on earth had just transpired. The silence that followed was unlike anything the narrator had ever experienced in the wilderness. Typically, the Canadian forest at night is alive with a symphony of sounds. Owls calling, branches creaking, small animals rustling through the undergrowth. But after the signals vanished, even those familiar noises seemed to fade away, replaced by an oppressive quiet that caused the narrator's ears to ring. They decided to take shifts monitoring the equipment through the night, optimistically hoping the signals might return as mysteriously as they had vanished. Dr. Mitchell took the first watch, followed by Lisa, then Alex. When the narrator's turn came at 4 a.m., she sat alone in the monitoring tent, surrounded by silent equipment and attempting to comprehend what had happened. The GPS system had never failed so completely before, and the timing, all signals cutting out at the exact same moment, suggested something far more serious than a simple technical glitch. She continuously checked and rechecked their data logs, hoping to find some pattern or explanation they had overlooked. Dawn brought no relief, only more perplexing questions. They packed up quickly and set out for the last known location of the nearest caribou herd, approximately 6 miles northeast of their camp. The hike through the dense forest was tense, everyone lost in their own thoughts about what they might discover. When they reached the area, there was no sign of the animals. No tracks, no droppings, no evidence they had ever been there. However, their equipment was undisturbed, sitting exactly where they had left it the previous day. Cameras, motion sensors, even the backup GPS units were all functioning normally, still recording data from their positions. It was as if the caribou had simply evaporated, leaving behind only the technology they had used to monitor them. Lisa suggested they expand their search radius, but Dr. Mitchell was already expressing concern about their timeline and limited resources. They spent the entire day searching a 12-mile area, finding nothing but empty wilderness and the growing certainty that something unprecedented had occurred. That evening, Lisa decided to review the thermal drone footage from the previous night. hoping to uncover some clue about what had happened to the caribou. They gathered around her laptop in the main tent, watching hours of grainy infrared video. Most of it showed precisely what they expected: empty forest, occasional small animals moving through the underbrush, the normal thermal signatures of a quiet wilderness night. But at 11:15 p.m., just 2 minutes before the GPS signals disappeared, the footage captured something extraordinary. 7 tall figures emerged from the tree line, moving in perfect synchronization across the open area near their camp. They were definitively humanoid, yet somehow wrong. Too tall, too coordinated, moving with a fluid precision that seemed almost mechanical. The thermal signatures indicated they were warmer than the surrounding environment, but cooler than normal human body temperature. Most disturbing was how they moved together like a single organism with multiple parts, maintaining exact spacing and identical movements as they traversed the frame and disappeared back into the forest on the opposite side. None of them spoke for several minutes after the footage concluded. Dr. Mitchell rewound it 3 times, meticulously studying every detail, while Alex kept muttering that the equipment must have malfunctioned. But Lisa and the narrator both knew what they were witnessing was real. The thermal imaging was too consistent, too detailed to be some kind of technical glitch. The figures were approximately 8 feet tall, with elongated limbs and movements that suggested an intimate familiarity with the terrain. They made no sound that the drone's audio equipment could detect, moving across fallen logs and dense undergrowth without disturbing a single branch. What haunted the narrator most was their unparalleled coordination. They weren't just walking in formation, but actively mirroring each other's movements down to the smallest gesture. When the lead figure raised what appeared to be its arm, all 7 performed the identical motion simultaneously. They watched the clip dozens of times, but it only generated more questions about what they were dealing with and whether it was connected to the caribou disappearance. That night, they implemented a buddy system. No one was permitted to leave their tent alone, and they established regular check-ins every hour until dawn. Despite their precautions, the narrator barely slept, listening intently to every sound outside and wondering if those figures were still out there watching them. Around 3 a.m., the narrator overheard Maria whispering urgently to Alex in the tent adjacent to hers. But when she called out to inquire if everything was all right, Maria replied that she had just experienced a bad dream. The remainder of the night passed without incident, but morning brought a new horror that rendered the previous day's mysteries seem trivial. When they gathered for breakfast at 7 a.m., Alex was missing. His sleeping bag was empty, his personal belongings still neatly arranged beside his cot, and his boots were gone. They searched the immediate area around camp, calling his name and checking all the places he might have wandered during the night. Dr. Mitchell was already discussing contacting emergency services when the narrator decided to check the riverbank, thinking perhaps Alex had gone for water and slipped on the muddy slope. What the narrator found at the water's edge defied every logical explanation she could conceive. Alex's hiking boots were placed with mathematical precision on a flat rock, positioned perfectly parallel to each other and facing directly toward the flowing water. The laces were tied in neat bows exactly as he always wore them, and there wasn't a single scuff mark or piece of mud on the leather. However, there were no footprints. Not leading to the boots, not leading away from them, nothing in the soft riverbank soil that would indicate how they had gotten there. The rock they sat on was completely dry, despite the morning mist that had dampened everything else in the area. The narrator called the others over, and they spent 2 hours meticulously examining every inch of the surrounding ground, searching for any trace of Alex's passage. The absence of tracks was absolute and utterly impossible. Even if someone had deliberately erased footprints, there would be telltale signs of the erasure itself. Yet the boots sat there like a carefully arranged display, as if they had been placed by someone who could move without ever touching the ground. They packed up camp immediately and hiked back to the nearest communication point to contact the authorities. The search and rescue operation lasted 4 days, involving helicopters, tracking dogs, and experienced wilderness teams, but no trace of Alex was ever found. The official report listed him as missing, presumed dead, with the working theory being that he had somehow fallen into the river and been swept away by the current. But that explanation did not account for the boots, which the investigators dismissed as irrelevant details. 6 months later, the narrator received a call from a forestry worker who had been conducting surveys in the same area. He had found something buried under a pile of stones near the old logging site, a GPS collar still functional, with data showing it had been stationary in that exact location since May 15th at 11:17 p.m. It was one of the collars from their missing caribou, and the timing perfectly matched when all the signals had disappeared. The narrator never returned to that site, and she has never worked on another research project in that region. Some mysteries, she concludes, are better left unsolved. By